To all the campers, what's the weirdest, creepiest, or most disturbing thing you have seen or experienced on your camping trips? I go camping every few months. A few years back, I went to this area that's not very popular and stayed with my friend in separate tents for a week. This place was in a forest. The first 4 nights were normal, but after that, small little things started happening. Like, we'd wake up and things would be knocked over or moved. This continued for 2 nights, and on our last night there, someone started to unzip my tent. I heard my friend yell, "I've got a gun," and then he started to come out of his tent. The guy ran off and we packed up and left. I'm a year-round hammock camper. Was out one night with a buddy camping in the snow. It's late, and I'm snuggled in tight. Suddenly, I hear little feet beating super quickly towards me, and much to my surprise, whatever it is shoots right under me. I'm using a minimal tarp, but I've got an integrated bug net which obscures my vision just enough. Strange and a little creepy, but I shrug it off and try to go back to sleep. The Sandman is almost upon me when the thing comes blazing back under me again. And then again and again. Thoroughly freaked out, I call out to my buddy to see if he is awake, and heard the thing. Turns out, he is lying there awake and equally creeped out. With both of us awake, we brave looking out. It was simply a fox with the zoomies going crazy through our campsite. Disturbing. Not so much scary, but totally disturbing. We were camping with friends at a private campground, about 100 acres of woods surrounded by farmland. A few hours after sunset, we started hearing these pitiful screams echoing through the trees. They weren't human, but that didn't make it any less disturbing, as they grew more panicked, louder, and more insistent as the hours went by. The caretaker drove up to the ridge to check on us. He explained that one of the local farms was weaning calves, and they did this by separating the babies from the herd and penning them in the pasture farthest from their house, which was next to the camp's property line. He came offering refunds of camp fees and earplugs. About half of us took him up on the earplugs. Those who didn't sat grimly at breakfast, describing how the screams became even louder and more bone-chilling as the hours drug on. One friend said a terrified toddler is a terrified toddler, even if it's on 4 legs and hooves. Nature didn't build that sound to be ignored. One night, I was camping alone. When I showed up to the campground, there were 2 cars parked in the parking lot. One was a family, and the other was a guy that looked like he was in his 30s. I didn't see him until after I set up my camp. The family left, and as they were leaving, the family man looked at me and told me to be safe. He looked kind of concerned. As the day turned and went dark, I noticed the guy who was still there was strange. He kept looking in and around his car, taking everything out and putting it back inside. He was on drugs and just fucking weird looking for a cigarette. He came to ask me for one, and I gave him one. I should have left, but I was stupid as fuck back then. Plus, it was late and I wasn't really near my home. I guess I could have went to rent a hotel, and looking back, I wish I did. The night was thunder and lightning and wind. I was enjoying seeing the lightning storm from inside my tent. I was finishing up the last of my beer and was ready to lay down and get some rest. I think I was trying to not be worried about that strange guy not too far away. My tent was by the bathroom, which had an outlet, so earlier in the day I had charged my phone just a bit. Anyway, as I lay down and got ready to doze off, I get a sickening feeling in my gut. It was windy outside, so the tent was moving a bit. Actually, quite a lot. It was loud. My mind went to fear very quickly. I started to think about the guy out there, and how I was there all alone, at night. I got on my phone, which still had a little bit of charge, and reached out to a few friends for comfort. Someone to talk to about where I was and how I was feeling. I don't think I'd ever been so scared in my life. I even cried, I was so scared. Just typing it, I'm getting the chills. Anyway, my phone died. I had no light except a little bit of moonlight, which made it possible for me to see shadows outside of my tent. I knew I wasn't alone. I had my knife in my hand, ready in case I needed to defend myself. I looked above me, and this, I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if it was real, but what I think I saw was a shadow above my head where I was laying that looked like a person. I thought I saw shoulders and the head just standing there. I was scared that the guy was standing right above me looking over my tent. This lasted a while. I held onto my knife so tight and didn't get a wink of sleep. One of the longest nights of my life. I honestly don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. Next time, I'll just get a hotel room for the night. I was camping in northern British Columbia, about 15 miles down an old logging road, 2 hours away from any civilization. In the dead of the night, me and my buddy were awoken by a sound neither of us have heard before, coming from a range about 2 miles away. It wasn't a bear, nor a wolf, nor a bobcat. It sounded like a cross between a gorilla and a grizzly. It kept growling and made what sounded like faint thumping noise, like a log being smashed against a tree. This went on for about 45 minutes, as we sat there, clutching our 12-gauge shotguns. The growling and thumping were getting closer, or so we thought. We said screw this and hastily threw everything in my truck, tossed water on the smoldering fire, and bailed. We hit the first truck stop about an hour later, and talking to the locals who were native, they told us we probably heard a Sasquatch, and the sounds we heard were some type of mating call. My buddy actually still lives out there, and now he's become a full-time Bigfoot tracker. When I was a kid, I went out hunting with my dad. We had seen a moose and her young following her. My dad said at the time, we don't want to fuck with them. But then around 10 to 15 minutes later, we hear this call, almost like a honk. Then we saw the female hauling ass toward us. My dad was scared she was charging us, but nope, she just ran past us. Then my dad got curious, and we walked back the way we came. What I saw still makes me a little scared 20 years later. One of the calves had been ripped in two, like mauled by something. The second calf was just missing all but its leg. My dad was extremely worried because 1, it takes a lot to scare off a mother moose, and I mean a lot. A mother moose will easily die for her young. And 2, there were no tracks. Nothing at all but moose tracks. We spent like 30 minutes looking for them, but found nothing except those tracks. And 3, most animals won't fuck with a mother moose, especially when her young is near, much less attack the young. If they were going to attack, they would usually go for the mother. Let me also say that this happened in an area where there aren't too many predators, especially not on the size to do this. There were wolves, coyotes, and maybe some honey badgers. I asked my mom later if my father said anything about it, and she said he never mentioned anything like it before he passed. Not exactly camping. We were in a forest at the edge of a cliff. A whole lot of us had spent the better part of the day digging trenches, one for each person. It started pouring at night, so we were all trying to sleep in our little graves, partially submerged in water/mud. Okay, not great, but not really disturbing. I hear some odd breathing and shuffling noises. I ignored it for a while as it got closer and closer, until it was really right above me. I look up and see a huge wild boar lumbering around the edges of my trench. At this point, I'm feeling pretty shitty, what with the cold and now this fat ass around. But then someone starts screaming, like he's getting murdered, like full on, going crazy. Everybody, and I mean fucking everybody, scrambles out of their trenches at the same time. It's dark as shit, and I could barely see whoever was in front of me, let alone find out where that screaming was coming from. For a good 5 minutes, we all just went around trying to find out what the hell happened. Turns out that some idiot got too close to the cliff's edge and almost fell off. The officers chewed him out, and everyone got to enjoy a nice long lecture the next day about safety. Weirdest thing that ever happened to me was when I was on top of a small mountain at a summer camp. We set up a tarp above us to catch the rain and slept in sleeping bags, with nothing covering our sides, so we were just laying on the ground with a single tarp hung 3 feet above us. Not the weird part. The camp is in Connecticut, and has an extremely high skunk population, so being the kids we were, we all kept on trying to lure said skunks near us, much to the confusion and horror of our British counselor. Around midnight, we hear this screeching noise, and we all get up. Turns out the skunks were indeed attracted to the food we left out for them, and even more so, attracted to each other. It took a couple minutes for our eyes to adjust, but we finally figured out that we were surrounded by a whole bunch of skunks fucking each other. It must have lasted for hours, because I don't remember the screeching stopping until the sun came out. I was camping back when I was 14 or 15 with 2 other friends. We'd set up in a field near a creek just outside of town. It wasn't too far from one of the guys' houses, so we'd hiked in maybe a mile or 2. Night came, we built a decent-sized fire, and were roughhousing in the field, sharing some beers that we'd stolen from who knows where. We wandered some distance from the campsite and started heading back. It was then that we saw a dark mass behind the fire, roughly in the shape of a person, almost like a shadow of something that was standing there. We all thought it was our one friend's dad coming to check on us, so we all yelled to him. No response. We decided it would be funny to throw some rocks then, since he wasn't responding. We threw some small gravel stones at the shadow. We could hear the stones hit something that wasn't the ground or the trees behind the shadow. We all kind of looked at each other, and at the same time, the shadow slipped down and scurried off into the woods. You could hear the footsteps, but there were too many, more like something with 4 legs or more would make. That wasn't the only time we had issues out in those woods, though. I may have been 5 at the time, but I still remember it with vivid detail. My grandmother and grandfather took me and my sister camping. My sister is older than me, so she chose where she was going to sleep first. The way our cabin was set up, outside there was a grill and a picnic table. Inside there was a master bed with a set of tall drawers up against the wall and a small TV that only played older shows. Going to the back of the cabin, there was a slim doorway, and inside there was 2 bunk beds. Me and my sister slept on the bunk bed on the right side of the room. She had the top bunk, and I obviously had the lower bunk. Our grandmother rolled the TV into the slim doorway. You could hear it roll on the hardwood floor in the cabin. At night, me and my sister cracked some glow sticks and went to sleep with the TV on. I heard some scratching on the little window in our room. I was a pretty smart kid, and I liked the outdoors, so I thought it was just a bird. But it started getting louder, and then the TV started cutting out, and it just showed static. This scared me at the time, so I hid under my covers, and eventually I did get to sleep. The next morning we went to the river, and my grandfather was talking to some rafters who got stuck on rocks, and I decided to rest near the area we were at. They asked him if he had a gun, and he said no. They told him to be careful, because they saw some weird people walking around. Luckily, we left that day, and I later asked my grandmother if she heard anything about the area we were in. She said that day we left, she got a call from the people who we rented the cabin from, and they told her that the night we were there, someone knocked out our cable. We were in a national park with horrible dirt roads, and we were driving around in our regular car, without 4-wheel drive or special tires. We had taken a few of these roads with success in more than one visit to a more remote location in the park, and were, on this occasion, trying to get back to the side of the park which we had come from using a new, horrible dirt road. The only problem was that this road turned into a riverbed. My husband starts attempting to back up. I warn him not to go to our right-hand side. I didn't articulate it, but there was a drop there which I knew the car couldn't handle. Husband says that he also knew that the car shouldn't go to our right, but for some reason his brain malfunctioned, and well, we were stuck on top of a riverbed with no reception. Luckily, the dirt was soft and there were no plants, although both of us went into a bit of panic mode. My husband started trying to dig the car out at once. I, however, was fixated on moving the car, just moving it a little bit to the left. That was all it would take, even though it was completely impossible. We both dug. I actually waited a little while to try to call 911, as I knew it wouldn't work. I wanted the problem to be easily fixable, and pretend that it wasn't necessary. When I finally gave in, there was no reception at all. It was getting dark. I realized that at this point, all we had to do to break free was lift the car slightly, what my panicked brain had actually been trying to tell me the whole time. We broke out the jack, and my husband swept away the rest of the mound beneath the car, with the tire iron, instead of the rocks we were using. We should have done this before, but our brains were too filled with panic. The car was free, and it was well and truly dark, but it was now making a strange noise. We were now afraid that it would break down and leave us well and truly stranded. We crawled back to the main road in the area, driving along slowly while screeching rattled our teeth. We had no idea where we were going at this point. Thank God that an older Asian couple stopped their Toyota minivan to talk to us. We would end up following them out of the park. A random act of kindness by these strangers helped us immeasurably. Also, thankfully, our car turned out to have gotten a pebble stuck someplace wheel-related, and was actually completely fine. The night wasn't done, though. At one point, I thought I saw a guy, just standing there silently, off to the side of the road with his head down. Something was very off about him. The way he was standing, and his general everything. I thought that it had been an illusion, until my husband commented on it. We both tried to explain it away as a scarecrow, until we talked to the couple. They had seen it too, and were sure that it had been a man. Eagle Scout here. When I was maybe 15 or 16, I was on my last requirement for the Wilderness Survival Merit Badge, which was a few-day stint in an isolated section of the woods with only food and water. When you are alone and trying to sleep under a makeshift lean-to on the ground in the woods at night, you start to realize just how alive the woods are. You can hear everything, even the slightest movements. The ground around me was very alive with the faint rustling of leaves and twigs of various bugs and other animals. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much. Also, just because it's dark and hard for us to see as humans at night, don't think you'll ever be the one sneaking up on anything in the woods at night, and that it's equally as difficult for animals to sense your presence. Every critter within 100 yards knew about my presence the entire time. At night, I could hear groups of shuffled walking that inched closer to me every 20 minutes or so. After a few hours, I was relieved to learn it was just a few deer letting their curiosity get the better of them, and they wanted to get a closer look at this white boy out here laying on the ground and figure out what his deal is. I once went camping with some friends. This was a long time ago. We had seen a group of people in reflective vests, though, in broad daylight, searching the river close to our camping spot. It was actually the first time I'd seen one of those swamp boats with the massive fan in use. At first, we thought they were looking for us. We weren't from the area at all, so seeing a team of people clearly searching the campgrounds, it was plausible we might have been reported for something. When my buddy's girlfriend returned from a trip to the grocery store, she heard there was a search and rescue team combing the campgrounds for a missing person. Sadly, I don't know if they ever found anything, but the experience sticks out in my mind to this day. A group of my friends and I like to go rock climbing, and on this particular trip, we were making a weekend out of the New River Gorge. Everybody calls it the New. The New has a couple different campsites that people can use, and this particular one was free because it was maintained by the National Park Service. A lot of people stayed at this campsite, most of which were climbers, hikers, trail runners, and other people who enjoyed being outdoors. However, because this was the only free campsite in the area, there were also some crazies who lived there. Mainly families who lived out of tents and minivans because they were so drugged up that they didn't have any other place to stay. We get to the campsite around 8:30 p.m., so the sun was almost unsetting, but we could still get a pretty good idea of who was in the campsite with us. Turns out, on this particular night, a group of redneck druggies were having some kind of bonfire at the site. They all had their motorcycles parked close to the trees, and they were all sitting around the campfire drinking. We didn't say anything because we didn't really have that much interest in them, and they looked like the kind of people where if you don't bother them, they won't bother you. We pitched our tent up at the farthest spot we could from them, but this was still pretty close, because the campsite was so crowded, and people only left this little circle of empty land around the biker gang because they didn't want to set up camp near them either. As a friend of mine and I were laying in our tent getting some well-needed shut-eye, we start to hear yelling coming from the biker gang. We thought that they were getting into a harmless argument about whatever sports team was better or whatnot, so we ignored it and tried to get back to sleep. A couple of minutes later, the yelling turns into screaming, and a couple of guys are yelling that they have knives or pistols. We then hear a female voice crying out that something has happened to her eye. She runs over to our tent and keeps on screaming in hopes that one of us will do something, but my friend and I were frozen in our tent and didn't move. Some other climber in the campsite who we met up with later the next day called the police, and we had no idea, but the biker gang had brought in more people in the time since we had fallen asleep. It took something like 20 police cars there to break up the gang and make some arrests. That campsite is now strictly monitored, and we haven't had something like that happen since. Not my story, but my friends, and the fact that I've heard this story from all four of them on separate occasions further proves its validity to me. Names in the story are changed for privacy. 4 of my friends were camping in the White Mountains of Arizona, somewhere near the Indian reservation, but not on it. I go camping at this location often too, I just happened to not be on this trip. This campground is always worth the drive with its massive pines, luscious quaking aspens, a large rolling hill valley covered in tall grass, and hundreds of raspberry bushes for a yummy treat. Well, when they're in season at least. My favorite thing about this area is that it's very remote, and seldom are there other campers close by or even in sight. You get the feeling of having the woods all to yourself. One night, my 4 friends decide to go spotlighting to possibly hunt down some small game. Miles announces that he has to pee, so they veer the truck to the side of the dirt trail, and he walks towards some greenery for privacy. The 3 other friends were patiently waiting for Miles. Then suddenly, they hear Indian drums and chanting coming from the distance. The driver looks in the rearview mirror and sees Miles sprinting toward the truck, simultaneously attempting to pull his pants up. At this moment, the three in the truck realize that they all heard the drums and chanting too. Miles safely makes it back into the truck, and he yells at them, "Go, drive!" Hurriedly, they speed off. They asked Miles, "What did you see? What happened?" Miles said, "I was peeing by a tree. No big deal." Then I hear the drums and chanting. That's when I looked up and I saw a shrine and a cross on the tree that I was peeing near. I didn't even see it there before. I got my ass out of that area as fast as I could. I would term this experience weird more than creepy, but it was definitely odd. Years ago, my boyfriend at the time and I would go camping almost every weekend. One of our favorite places was the Meechaw State Forest in Pennsylvania. We always bushwhacked out to remote sites, hunter sites that were by creeks with no one else around. He was really into the outdoors, but kind of a know-it-all dick about it. He would never let me get the fire going or set up the tent. I was always on water filter duty or some crap like that. And for being an outdoorsy guy, he never seemed to actually relax into the beauty of the wild. He smoked a ton of weed and stayed glued to the fire, and during the day he was just kind of checked out. I was the opposite. I had grown up exploring the woods and felt very at home in nature. I would always wake up earlier than him, take a dunk in the creek, explore the area. At night, he'd pass out early and I would stay awake listening to the crickets, great horned owls, and other incredible sounds of the forest. One trip, we were camped out on this really cool site right near a rushing creek. The creek had these big, flat rocks on the water's edge covered in thick, soft moss. It was amazing. I told him it was a fairyland. I had always thought that fairies slept on moss beds when I was a kid. He laughed it off, but I was convinced we were actually in a blessed place. That night, he passed out as soon as it got dark. I was in the tent, restless and bored, and irritated with him for being such a wet blanket. I realized I had to pee, so I got out, walked a far enough distance from the camp and the water, and squatted. As I was doing my business, my attention was grabbed by something over near the creek. I finished up and walked a few paces back toward the tent, keeping my eyes on whatever it was that I had seen. A cluster of lights forming a circular shape was floating above the water. At first, I assumed it was fireflies, but there were no other fireflies to be seen, and I had seen none at all during our trip thus far. Then, the light bulb blinked on and off, on and off. It was many separate lights grouped together. When they blinked on again, the light mass had moved closer to me. It twinkled, for lack of a better word. I wasn't at all scared. It felt like a playful energy, and I watched it kind of twinkle and zip around the woods. It stayed at enough of a distance from me that it felt equally respectful and wary. So I did what any rational human that believes in fairies would do. I waved and whisper shouted, "Thank you, beautiful friends," and the light bulb blinked in rapid succession, then kind of just floated off. It seemed like the entire forest was giddy with happiness. I never told my boyfriend about it. It felt like a very special and personal experience, and we didn't last much longer anyway. I don't know what it truly was, but I know I never had a spooked vibe, and I felt really lucky to have seen it. I love being outside, so I camp as often as I can. A few years ago I was in Scouts, and we went on a camping trip for about 3 days, and the park rangers told us to make sure our food was locked up and hung in a tree so bears wouldn't come looking for food in our camp. The first night, some intelligent human being left a cooler full of sandwiches on a picnic table, so at like 2 in the morning I wake up to footsteps and sticks breaking. My fight or flight response was freaking out, but I knew if I tried anything, there was a 300-pound, not-so-cuddly fur ball that would tear me apart. So I'm just laying in my tent trying not to pee myself, and this bear was walking around for about half an hour. Then I hear a huge thunk, and something gets flipped over. The next morning, I got out of my tent and found the table upside down 15 feet away from where it was originally, and the cooler gone. Let's just say we didn't make that mistake again. My mother and father-in-law went camping 2 years ago across country on a trip. They stopped off at Yosemite National Park to camp. They were fast asleep, and at 3 a.m. they were awakened by what they thought was a truffle windstorm, at least initially, as the whole side of the tent was pressing in against them. My mother-in-law was up first, and shouted that something was on the tent. About that same time, my father-in-law realized something was pressing in on his face, so he pushed up as hard as he could, and found no more weight. They carefully exited the tent and went to their vehicle, only to realize my father-in-law had 4 bear-sized tooth marks on his cheek. Other than a few puncture marks, it wasn't serious, luckily. They saw the bear approaching their neighbors, So they started the car, drive over, honk, and shout for the couple and their child to escape to their vehicle. They then went over quite a distance to get to a phone and call the authorities. They gave medical care to my father-in-law and later told him it's been 20 years or more since there have been any attacks at all. They went through everything to try and figure out what happened, and they found the tooth marks in the tent and in their brand new air mattress. They speculated it may have been the petroleum in the mattress that attracted it, since they are very aware, experienced campers who followed the normal protocols for keeping the food and garbage hung up and out of reach. They ended up helping the mattress to analyze further. I may be forgetting some details, however, when we first found out, it was of course quite shocking. These days, there are basically no scars left. I honestly forget it's happened most of the time. They were very lucky that that's all that happened.